Hi guys, so this is going to be the first episode of hopefully a series of videos that I'm going to be making regarding second language acquisition research. Pretty much the history of second language acquisition research. But you may ask, why are you making these videos, or why are you focusing on second language acquisition research? Well, I think that here in the YouTube community we are all interested in languages, language learning, and language education itself. And I think that a really cool way to get to know a little bit more about what is going on today is to, analyze the story of second language acquisition and the way that it has evolved. Because nowadays we use a lot of books, a lot of methods, a lot of approaches, we go to classes, but I think that it's important to know where all of that come from. And I think that the best way to actually know about this is to know about the history of this field, of the field of second language acquisition, and basically that's the reason why I'm making this series of videos. Now, the first thing that you have to know about second language acquisition is that, second language acquisition research is that it's a relatively new discipline. It's not really that old. It's not really that old as you might have guessed. It's actually quite new. It's from the 70s, so it's not really that old. It's a young type of scientific discipline. But just because it's young, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have anything to offer. On the contrary, it has a lot to offer, and that's one of the things that is actually quite amazing about it, because it's a young discipline, but it has already contributed into a lot of research, a lot of analysis, a lot of literature, and it's quite amazing, and that's why I find it so interesting also. So I think that the best way to start with this whole idea of SLA research, second language acquisition, is with behaviorism. So that will be our first stop here, okay? That will be like what this first episode, this first pilot episode is all about, behaviorism. If you know a little bit about psychology, you probably already know what behaviorism is. If you're not, well, behaviorism is just, a psychological discipline or a psychological approach that it tends to study, as its name says, the behavior of things, the observable behavior of things, or better yet, the habits that living things have. And for a behaviorist, that's the best way to understanding the mind of someone, by watching the habits and the behavior, and everything has to be observable for a behaviorist. And for a behaviorist, habits are everything. Now you're probably wondering, wait a minute, we are here to learn about languages and language acquisition. Why the hell are you talking about psychology and behaviorism? Well, that's where it all started, actually, in second language acquisition. Like the first initiators, or the first individuals who actually kind of created the whole discipline, were psychologists, and this resulted in basically a kind of revolution that happened with psychology, in which education started to get more and more psychological. So there was like this, with the advent of psychology, there was this kind of revolution of points of view regarding education. And obviously that happened also with language education. So that's our first stop, and that's basically the origin point of second language acquisition. It all started with psychologists, basically, because psychologists wanted to know what happened inside the mind of an individual that was learning two languages. They wanted to know, what was the whole process like inside the mind, inside the brain of the student. So they wanted to know they especially wanted to know what was the relationship between the L1 and the L2. How can they coexist together in the brain? And initially they thought that it was actually an antagonistic relationship. I have a quote here by Martin in 1981. He said, "Taking a psychological point of view, we can say that there is never peaceful coexistence between two language systems in the learner, but rather constant warfare, and that warfare is not limited to the moment of cognition, but continues during the period if strongly new learned ideas in memory." Now, as you can see, they were actually quite aggressive towards the L1 of the students. Why was this? Well, as you remember, behaviorism, it's all about habits, and for a behaviorist, education is basically, to be educated is to formulate new habits. When you're learning a new skill, you are formulating new habits. Now, when it comes to languages, the L1 basically represents your old habits, and your L2 represents your new habits. So you don't have to look at your old habits, you have to focus on your new habits. And that's why they kind of hated the L1, because the L1 represented old habits, and you were trying to learn new habits, which was the main purpose of it all. And that's why they were so hostile to the whole idea of actually learning with an L1. Now, let's get on back with behaviorism. The principal, figures on behaviorism were psychologists John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. They had a little bit different ways of viewing the whole idea of languages, or the whole idea of education. Now, they define habits in a different way. So, for example, Watson defined a habit as a stimulus that becomes linked with a response. So, for Watson, a habit was basically like I give you a stimulus, and that stimulus will generate a response, and that's the response that you're going to have every time that something happens. So something happens, you do this, that's a habit, that's the stimulus, that's everything. But with Skinner had actually a different point of view. He actually said that it's not just about stimulus. He says that there was actually imitation involved, imitation and reinforcement, and that was the actual thing that created a real response. It was not just about the stimulus, it was all about the notion of imitating, and that was basically like his language learning theory, that we imitate, and that's the way that we start to get reinforcement on a new language. Okay, so a thing that you have to understand about these early theories of second language acquisition based on behaviorism is that they detested errors. For them, errors were serious things. It's not like many methods today that say, oh, an error is a completely normal part of learning. No, for the behaviorist, error is actually the opposite of learning, is anti-learning. An error was something that should be avoided at all costs, and if you committed errors, that meant that you weren't learning actually. An error wasn't a part of learning, it was something that was completely against learning. So basically, errors were all habits, and all habits were undesirable at the moment of learning new languages. And now, based upon the whole ideas of behaviorism of Skinner and Watson, a lot of linguists and a lot of teachers started to follow the idea of behaviorism, the idea that we must formulate new habits in the L2 and we must get rid of all habits, and that means the L1. And basically a lot of linguists started to follow that idea, and it was in the year 1957 when a linguist called Robert Lado finally created a theory based on these principles, on these behaviorism principles, and that theory was what we know today as contrastive analysis. What the hell is contrastive analysis? Well, the notion of contrastive analysis basically says that while you're trying to learn L2, all the problems that you have, all of the difficult parts, and all of the hard stuff that you have to deal with in an L2, basically, that's because of your L1. Your L1 is like the responsible for everything that you are struggling with. If you're struggling with an L2, that's because of your L1. Your L1 is like infecting your learning of your L2. They claim that the reason why we make mistakes learning a second language was because our first language was infecting our second language. That's what the followers of contrastive analysis said. So, you know, everything was because of your L1. Your L1 was like the worst criminal ever. So obviously in contrastive analysis they got rid of the whole L1, but not only that, they thought that it was possible to predict the hard stuff that someone will have to deal while learning a second language just by observing what was your L1. For example, imagine that I'm implementing contrastive analysis here, and you're a student, your mother language is English, and you're trying to learn French. So just by that, I'm able to predict what are going to be the hard, difficult subjects for you in French, because I'm basically just going to take English, I'm basically just going to take French, and I'm going to compare them, or going to contrast it in some way. I'm going to do like a cross-reference, and I'm going to see which parts of English are different from French, and by that I'm able to see which parts are going to be hard for you. The parts that are really different from English are going to be the hardest parts for you. That's the logic of contrastive analysis. So I should focus first on the parts that are really different from English and then move on. And that's the way that the followers of contrastive analysis thought. They said that basically just by looking at your L1 and then looking at what language you are going to study, we were able to predict what were going to be the difficult material or the difficult subjects that you will have to eventually study. And you know, it seems like a logical idea, right? Like, okay, yeah, the parts that are the most different from our L1 are going to be the hardest parts while learning an L2. The more different a language is, the harder it's going to be, right? And we should focus on the different things first and everything, and obviously ignore completely the L1, because as contrastive analysis says, there is an interference. The L1 interferes with the L2. The L1 infects the L2. So contrastive analysis became a really popular idea in the 50s, and pretty much everyone believed it. And all of the teachers started to use methods based completely on the whole idea of contrastive analysis developed by Robert Lado, based upon the behaviorist theories of Skinner and Watson. And this was an idea that had a lot of time. Actually, it had a lot of life, and a lot of teachers implemented. There's actually a lot of teachers that still implement it, but basically it was the idea that everyone believed it, and through the whole 60s, contrastive analysis was a really popular method until the beautiful decade of the 70s, in which linguists and language teachers actually started to question the validity of contrastive analysis. They started to question this whole idea that they had assumed all of this time. And they started to say, man, we really need to actually know if this is true, if L1, if there's actually such thing as an interference. Or they basically attack the idea that contrastive analysis posed, the idea that the L1 is responsible for all of the errors that were presented in the L2 learning. They wanted to attack that idea, because there was actually no kind of deep research about it. So it was time to actually prove it was actually time to put contrastive analysis to the test. So they did. They made some research in the 70s, and they discovered that there were errors in an L when a student of a second language. There were errors that came obviously from the L1, but there were also errors that didn't actually came from the L1, that were like random errors, or there were errors, complete errors of form. They actually watch the way that certain people say like a lexical phrase or a syntax phrase, and they actually realized that they were using a completely different syntax from the L2 and from the L1, so they created a whole syntax that was not even the syntax that they used under L1. So that first research showed that there are errors that occur because of the L1, but not all errors are because of the L1. So the followers of contrastive analysis said, well, okay, there are errors that don't come from L1, but the majority of the errors committed by L2 learners come from the L1. Now it's no longer all of the errors, now it's the majority of errors. And those linguists said, okay, that's fine, but then a few years later, they actually started to question that too. Is it really that the majority of errors come from the L1? They wanted to know if the L1 actually infected the L2 learning that much. So they made a whole new other wave of research, and this second new wave of research basically meant the fall of contrastive analysis, because they discovered that the idea was, wrong. The majority of the errors don't come from our L1. That was what these researchers discovered. The L1 doesn't infect that much the L2 learning. It's a reason, but it's not even the majority. It's just a really, really low percent of how much our L1 infects our learning of the L2. So that was the moment in which this whole idea of contrastive analysis collapsed, because we just realized that we have been blaming the L1 for years, and now we are able to see that the L1 is not guilty. It's not guilty at all. Well, it's a little bit guilty, but not at the degree that we expected to be, or at the degree that we thought. So I think that with the whole history of contrastive analysis, we basically were able to see that the L1 is actually not that bad. It's not as as detrimental as we thought, and the whole notion of interference is not really that present. So yeah, with this whole story of contrastive analysis, we learned that our L1 is not really that bad when it comes to a second language. But actually, there was a linguist called Corder that actually took the principle of interference and actually made it evolve into a new kind of principle called intercession. And he actually discovered that the L1 actually was helpful at the moment of learning an L2. So your L1 wasn't your enemy. You could use your L1 as actually your ally while learning your L2. This is a quote from his. When learners experience difficulty in communicating an idea because they lack the necessary target language resources, they will resort to their L1 to make up the insufficiency. This explains why the L1 is relied on more at the beginning of the learning process than later. So he said that at the beginning of the process, your L1 was actually quite helpful because it made you capable of making up, as he said, the insufficiency that you have on your L2. So you can use, as a beginner, you're really dependent from your L1. But as you move on, your L1 becomes unnecessary because you are more capable of saying stuff on your L2. And that is the notion of intercession, which is actually opposite than interference. Interference says that our L1 infects our L2, and the notion of intercession is that no, our L1 actually helps us at the beginning stages to learn more about our L2. But contrastive analysis is still alive in some kind of ways, and it was correct in a certain aspect. It was correct in the notion of phonology. So contrastive analysis wasn't right at the moment that he said that our L1 infects our L2. And in terms of language knowledge, that wasn't true, but this is true in the terms of phonology, and I think that's quite obvious. In the case of phonology, it's obvious that our L1 infects our L2. We are always going to have an accent. If you are in French and you learn English, obviously your French is going to infect your English in terms of phonology, and you are going to have an accent. But in terms of languages, what really matters is communication. So it doesn't really matter if you have an accent or not, because if you're able to communicate, well, that's really all that matters. So this has been all. This was the first episode of this series of SLA research. In this series we talked a little bit about behaviorism and contrastive analysis, the rise and fall of contrastive analysis, and there are going to be more videos about this series discussing other SLA research materials. So I hope you enjoy that, and see you later.